And for this month, we're very fortunate to have the program on the CCC, and I am going to have Peggy introduce the speaker, because I did not know we were having a different speaker until last night. So Peggy, if you will do it.
Hi, I'm Peggy Sanders, and I've been involved with the Civilian Conservation Corps work, the history, since my book came out in 2004. And when I was asked to speak about it, I thought, yeah, I can do that. But if the weather's good, I'm going to bring you a bona fide CCC man to speak. And this is Jay Hendrickson. He was 95 on Valentine's Day. We'll just get that out of the way. He lives in Hill City with his wife, Elaine. And Jay has worked hand in hand with a bunch of us to create the CCC Museum of South Dakota. Jay was in the seats, and I'll let you tell you about that. He was also, I don't know what else he's done, but I know he was the state president of the Lions Eye Bank in Sioux Falls, and he has been, he's a Lion, and he is very, very active in that sort of thing. So I'll let you listen to Jay.
I'd like to start kind of telling you a little bit about, probably some of you might know that too. Some of them might remember the CCs. Do you remember the CCs? There's one back there, another one. Yeah. But anyway, in 1933, with kind of rough times, as everybody knows, around the country, and when President Roosevelt was inaugurated, he had the idea to take people off the streets and out of the woods over here and try to give meaningful employment. Plus he would do meaningful works, that would lasting works that would help. And one point, he was inaugurated on the 4th of March in 1933, and he sent a bill to the Congress, the ECW, which was Emergency Conservation Works. He sent it to Congress. 4 days later, it was all through both houses of Congress and on his desk for signature. And this was by the middle of April. By the first part of April, he'd already established these CC cabins. And he was trying to do that today. But anyway, the first camp was in Virginia, and it was appropriately named Camp Roosevelt. But anyway, the thing was set up, and it was in existence from 1933 to 1942. And the reason it was disbanded in 1942 was that Congress wouldn't appropriate any more money because the war was on there. And if it hadn't been for the war, it probably been in existence longer. The camps themselves, I might give you a little rundown on how they were run. They were run, well, first of all, Roosevelt had to get somebody to organize this thing, so he thought about the Army, which already had an organization in place. The camps were run by the Army. Each camp was run by had a company commander, much like the Army, It had a first officer and a medical officer in each camp. They had a first sergeant, they had a mess sergeant, they had a supply sergeant, and each camp was set up to accommodate 200 men. That was the average. Maybe some were larger or smaller, but that was the average way it was set up to be. They had regular day would be get you up at 6 in the morning and feed you at 7, and you go on sick call if you were sick, and then you'd go to work call immediately after about 8 o'clock. I mean, at that work call, you were turned over to different people to operate your. While you were in camp, you were strictly under the auspices of the Army, but once you left the camp to work, then you were under the services of the Forest Service, Department of Interior, Soil Conservation Service, National Park Service, and lots of times other services. Each camp had an education advisor assigned to the camp, because found out that some of those kids that come in to the camp needed schooling. So they had regular schools that they set up in the camp. And they had the classes in woodworking, they had classes in auto mechanics, typing, bookkeeping, welding, and anything else that they could dream of to teach these kids. Reading and writing was another one, because some of the guys that come in couldn't read or write well. So it was I think it was a great deal that they were thinking about the welfare of the kids when they come in there. They also didn't forget about recreation. Each camp had probably a baseball team, a basketball team, and they had swimming, and they had all kinds of, they had a day room that they set up, which they have books in there, they have a radio, they had a pool table, and a lot of the camps even had a band that they'd get together and play music. It was quite a deal. And another thing they didn't forget about was their religion, was church. Every Sunday they run a truck to camp, and you take you whatever denomination you were, and you could go to church. The projects that the CC did during that time were, a lot of them were for conservation, and another were for public people, public buildings and stuff like that. So the buildings that they built in Custer, they built a huge log building there. The community center there was one of the largest buildings that was built by CCs. They built ranger stations for the rangers. They built one at Rochford. You ever know where Rochford is? They built one at Savoy over in Spearfish Canyon. And then they built one at Camp Crook. You know where Camp Crook is? Way up in the corner there. And one at Nemo. They built those for the Forest Service. Plus, they built all kinds of roads, because when the first CC was established, there wasn't any secondary roads in the hills to speak of. There was gravel roads like through Hill City and Custer, but there's secondary roads into the hills. I know one place on one creek on Casapella, there was 15 dams, about 15 bridges on that road, and opened up that country. And when they left, you could take a car and drive most every place in the Black Hills with just a two-wheel drive car. They built that good of roads. And next to another project that they were involved in was lakes. As if you know that there was no natural lakes in the Black Hills. There isn't one, not even one natural lake. There was one lake, and that was Silver Lake up here, but that was a resort that somebody built way back in the 1800s. But when the CCs come there, they're like a bunch of beavers. If they see running water, they want to dam it and pick it up. So just just a overview of a few of the lakes that they built. They built the Dorn up by Custer. Everybody knows where that lake is. Bismarck, near Custer. They built Center Lake. They built Horse Thief Lake. A lot of people think that they built on Mount Rushmore, but they didn't. They did have a camp that was just outside of Mount Rushmore, and they did a lot of the work around Mount Rushmore, including Horse Thief Lake. They built that Horse Thief Lake. They were only about 2 miles from Rushmore, and they built roads around there. They did a lot of work in that area. Let's see. They built Sheridan. You know where Sheridan Lake is? That was a project. And Newton up by Hill City. They built Mitchell Lake up by Hill City. They built Major Lake. And they built Iron Creek Lake over by Spearfish there. They built Bear Butte Lake. And they did extensive work on Gorman Dam. Gorman Dam, when they come there, had been built quite a few years before, and it was pretty bad repair. So they rebuilt the spillway. They built, I don't know how many miles, many miles of irrigation tubing and stuff like that. So there was a lot that they did in the Black Hills and the lakes. And we enjoy those today. Fishing, everybody go fishing. Can you fish in the roof? No. Yeah, well, anyway, I might list some other projects. You know, the CCs weren't just in the Black Hills, they were all over the state. I think at one time there was as many as 33 camps at one time in the state. And one of the camps I mentioned before was Camp Crook, and they did range management work a lot. You built dock dams, stuff like that up in the northwest corner of the state. Sand Lake, you know where Sand Lake is up by Aberdeen? They did an extensive project on that. And Crow Creek Dam north of Chamberlain at that time was one of the largest earthen dams in the world. It was built with CC labor. They built Beersford, a camp at Beersford, and that was soil conservation camp. They taught the people to soil conservation, terracing and all that kind of stuff. At La Creek, you know, anybody know where the creek is? That's way down on the Nebraska border. That was kind of a wetlands and a migratory bird. They had a camp there and they worked there for several years. Here, our capital, they built a big Farm Island Park there. And they built some other establishments there, like shelters and stuff like that. And in the Badlands, they had a camp right just southwest of the wall. And they did, whatever you do, they built the visitor center on the Badlands at that time. Another thing, they built in the park, they did extensive work in the South Dakota State Park. And they built the cabins and also the hotel, Silver Lake Hotel, which everybody enjoys. That was all built with CC labor. And Bluebell cabins were built by CC labor. They built, I might add there that we say that the CCs built those things. Well, they did in the fact that they provided the labor, but every one of those projects had to have a project engineer, which wasn't a CC, it was probably a contractor someplace that did the technical work, because I can't imagine an 18-year-old boy building something like a building, you know, without a lot of guidance. They built campgrounds throughout the hills, many campgrounds. And they built fire trails by the hundreds Another major project they did was the pigtail bridges over on the Iron Mountain Road. You know where those are? Those were built with CC labor. We did extensive tree planting throughout the hills. We used to have a bag on your back, and you had a, what you call a pick Maddex, and you drive it into the ground, and step on the handle, put the tree in, then pull it out. And we planted, a man could plant about 500 or 600 trees every day. And we did that in the old Rochford burn that burnt before. It was burnt all the way from Black Fox all the way up to Custer Peak. And another major job they had was firefighting. They did many, many hours of firefighting. And in conjunction to that, lookout towers. You know where Rankin Ridge is? That's not too far from here. They built Bear Mountain, which is out by Custer there, northwest of Custer. They built Mount Coolidge, and Hardy Peak, and Flag Mountain, Castle Peak, Custer Peak, Terry Peak, Cement Ridge, Crow Peak, and South Bullock. That's the ones I can come off the top of my head, but they probably did more. Now some of those were there before, but they rebuilt them. Like Hardy Peak had a little wooden tower up on there at the beginning, and they built a stone tower there. I don't know. That's about the gist of what I want to talk about, but I'd like to talk about the museum too. The museum, as Peggy had mentioned before, we've had that in operation for several years. Pretty nice little museum. We had been used to, in the early days, after the CCs, we used to have reunions. And we'd get at first a couple other people at the reunions. Well, it finally dwindled down so it wasn't getting so many. And in the meantime, we had talked about having a museum to promote the legacy of the CCs. And at that time, I had a friend in Rapid that made some money, and he donated some stock to us, and we purchased a CCC statue, which is out in front of our museum in Hill City. And that was about $20,000. And I and some others worked on a grant from Deadwood from the gambling, and we got $25,000 there. And then we had a major fundraising thing going, and we got some more money there. So we have quite a bit of money into the thing. And another surprising thing about the museum is whenever you decided to do it, all these artifacts and stuff come out of the woodwork. People have them in their garage or something, and they drag them up, and here they come dragging them in there. We have pictures of most all the camps, and I think at this time I would probably entertain if anybody got any questions.
I have one. What is the difference between the CCC camps and the WPA camps?
The CCC and the WPA was all under the Emergency Works Administration. But WPA was for people who were lived at home and were sort of hard up or something, and they were in public works around the country. And there was also, besides them, there was PWA, and they built commercial buildings in town. That was the difference, but it was all under the same umbrella. Yeah, my dad was on that too.
My dad was WPA, so he also started everybody on WPA when he had two shovels.
Someone over here.
Would you tell us about the pay that the CCC workers got?
Yeah, I almost forgot that. We got paid, you know. But anyway, you got $30 a month. And of that $30, $25 they sent home for it. So you had $5. However, when you think about it, you got your board and room, and you got clothing, clothe you, and in today's dollars, I tried to compute that, but it's not too bad really in today's dollars, because at least would be at least 20 to 25 times more in today's dollars. But it wasn't bad. And to a young guy that had been running the ridges up around Mystic like why, it was a godsend. It was really a godsend, because you had nothing to do and there was no chance of a job. But any other questions?
Two questions. First one is, how did you get involved with the CCC as an individual? And second question is, who identified and approved these projects that the group worked on?
How do we identify those?
Right.
Well, first of all, as far as I'm concerned, I was enrolled into the CCs as a local experienced man. Now, if you can imagine, and I lied about my age 2 years to get in there, so I was only 16 years old. But you know, actually, I was experienced in relation to some kid coming off the prairie that never seen an axe or a grub hole or anything like that, because I could help, you know. And I was enrolled by the forest ranger enrolled me, which I knew. So I think that probably helped too, you know. And on the other, how to identify how the project to be done.
Right. Who did that?
I think it was like the Forest Service. They identified the projects they wanted to do. Soil conservation probably too. The Park Service, like down in the park here. I would guess that's probably right.
What was the age range? If you were lying at age of 16,
It was supposed to be 18 to 25 when I went in. They did add to that a little bit later on, but at the time I went in 37. I went in 37. And it was 18 to 25.
Was there any upper limit? I mean, could you be like
25 was supposedly, but they did have some older, and some of them stayed in a little longer. The enlistment period was 6 months, but you could re-up for up to 2 years before enlistment.
comparison to the WPA, were they an older group if they went home while they were
Generally married
married?
people lived at home, and they worked on the roads or something like that.
Yeah, I know they did all the rock work at Wind Cave and the
Oh yeah, I was going to mention Wind Cave. Wind Cave right near here, you know, there was a camp right by Wind Cave. Some of the buildings are still there.
Yes.
And they did the elevator in Wind Cave. They strung all the lights and they went, you know, and they built, I don't know how many of those buildings up there, but I think most of those buildings along there by the entrance there were built by CCs. Yeah.
What camp were you in and what did you do?
Oh, I was in 3 different camps. I was in first at Mystic, which was close to my home there. And there I worked in the woods, worked on roads, drove a truck. And then I was transferred to Roe Bay, and I helped build a Roe Bay Dam up there. I was a truck driver on that. And then after that, I was transferred to Fort Meade to the headquarters company up there, in headquarters detachment. And I was there. I was worked in the garage and drove an official car. That's the reason I know where a lot of these camps are, because they had inspectors that went around and inspected the camps. And I was one of the drivers that drove around. So, but that's what I did there mostly. But it was very enlightening. I drove those guys all the way out, all over the states, in fact. So I got to see all the camps, a lot of the camps that were in operation. You know, about 38 or something like that.
So would you say that it was a great experience to enter into the rest of your life?
Yeah, actually, it really empowered my life up until now. when I got out of CC camp, I went to work and I worked a year, and then I was drafted into the Army. Well, I don't know whether somebody told them or they found out that I'd had this experience in the CCs. But anyway, a month after I was in the CCs, or in the Army, I was a corporal. 3 months later, I was a sergeant, and 6 months later, I was a staff sergeant. And they ended up my World War II experience as a lieutenant. So I'm sure that helped. It was I don't regret a minute of it. It was, even in the Army, and I was called back in the Korean War also. I'm happy. Yeah.
Did that time in CC, did that count for your time in military service or civil service?
Wish it would. No, they didn't.
Okay. I just wanted to ask.
But, you know, I think Roosevelt, when he set this all up, I think he had, I don't know, but in my opinion, he had in the back of his mind that this war was looming, you know, and the things that, like the other countries, Germany and other countries were building towards that he got that together. And when the war broke out, he had 3 million plus men that had some military experience.
It's all like basic training camp.
Yeah, something like basic training, you know, because I never had any basic training when I went in the service. Yeah.
Were those 5 towers, were they manned like the one on Hardy Peak and the rest of them? Or they manned?
Yeah, during the CCs, they were manned by CCs.
Okay.
But after the CCs left, of course, they were manned by civilians then. And now, of course, they do it all with an airplane. They run around the country with an airplane.
Okay, you say they were manned. How do they communicate when the people in these towers saw?
I might mention that too.
How do they communicate to the ground
The
workers?
CCs built hundreds of miles of telephone line to those towers to interconnect them. And then they had a system in the towers of triangulation that they would locate towers. You have a tower here and a tower there, and they're triangulate. They sight on the fire, and they could pinpoint it pretty close. Yeah.
I did not know they had telephones back then.
Who's that?
Me, I didn't know they had telephones that long
Yeah,
ago.
they had telephones.
Dad would have telephoned before Cheyenne did.
So you obviously lived around here, and did you live on a ranch or a farm, or what was?
I lived in a log cabin, a pony gulch by Mystic. And
Is that far from here?
well, Mystic is about 15 miles northeast of Hill City, on Castle Creek.
And what did you do? What did you or your family do?
Well, my dad worked in the timber. At that time, there was a sawmill at Mystic, and he worked in that timber for that when I went to CC. But jobs were very, very scarce. Here's one of the tools we used. That's a draw knife. You know what a draw knife is? There's a picture of the guy that used that. And next, there's a picture of me when I was a CC captain. And I have a picture of my old CC camp here.
On some of the recruits.
And I might mention at this time, I got a book that was written by Peggy over here. And I don't know why she didn't drink so long, she got rid of it. Where'd she go? Anyway, and here's a kind of a Bible of the CCs in South Dakota. I don't know whether it's out of print or not. It's one of the Bibles. the things I have to pick up where the camps in the park were.
Did you want this passed?
I don't know, yeah, sure. That's the guy that did this whole wall.
I have one comment. Sure. Didn't want something to shift on the states too, like they were overcrowded here to go to another state. How did that work out? My brother ended up dead in Arkansas.
Oh, yeah. I should have mentioned that it wasn't just South Dakota had CCs. There were every state, Puerto Rico, Alaska, Virgin Islands, and Hawaii. They were all over. And at one time there was 34,000 camps no, 3,400 camps, not 34,000.
Why do you need to pull to take the bar off the fence post?
Oh, that's when you gotta take the bar of the bugs are in there and they'll rot. And you take the bark off and then oftentimes they freeze with something to it. Thank you for that question. I probably missed something, but I'd like to make an observation here. I believe that in the 9 years that the CCs were in existence, that more was done for conservation in South Dakota during that time than was done before and not quite possibly since. Right? They've let everything go to pot, you know. The things that the CC started to build, like the Forest Service, they kind of drag their feet on it. I do believe that.
Well, if there's no more questions, I thank you very much.